Do you remember the moment when everything you thought was permanent suddenly felt fragile? Perhaps it was a housing crash, a bank failure, or a global pandemic. That single moment of profound uncertainty is exactly where the greatest empires begin to fall. For decades, the Soviet Union projected an image of eternal, monolithic power. It had nuclear weapons to deter any military attack, a vast secret police to suppress any internal dissent, and a colossal 5-year plan to ensure economic continuity. The West looked at the USSR and saw a superpower, a nation capable of challenging the globe. But if you were a citizen of that empire, living behind the Iron Curtain, did you ever stop to ask yourself where the money came from? Where was the financial foundation of this great communist project? The terrifying truth is that the Soviet Union wasn't destroyed by a nuclear missile, and it wasn't defeated by a frontal ground invasion. It was brought down by a monster that the government itself created. Debt. Not the kind of debt you see on Wall Street, but a hidden cancerous form of systemic liability. A bond market nightmare, where the borrower and the bank were the same entity, the state, and the creditors were the very citizens who had no choice but to participate in their own financial ruin. Think about your own financial life today. When you take out a loan, you trade a promise for current value. When a government issues a bond, it does the same. This is the bedrock of modern capitalism. But the Soviet system was fundamentally different, and this difference was its death sentence. In the USSR, there was no free market. Everything, from the collective farms to the massive steel factories, belonged to the state. And the state, being omnipotent, couldn't really owe money to anyone outside itself, right? That was the official lie. The reality was a hidden mountain of internal obligations, a massive network of what we can call ghost debt. The Soviet economy was a gigantic closed loop. The state bank, Gosbank, issued currency, the ministries spent it according to the central plan, and citizens were paid in non-convertible rubles. Where did the bond market come in? It was compulsory. Soviet citizens were regularly pressured, and often outright required, to purchase state bonds. These weren't investment opportunities. They were forced contributions to the 5-year plan, a patriotic duty. They were IOUs issued by the government to itself, backed by nothing but the political stability of the party. The key detail here is the massive difference between a Western bond and a Soviet bond. A Western bond promises a return on real production. A Soviet bond promised a return on ideology. The early success of the Soviet Union after World War II, when it rapidly industrialized and achieved milestones like Sputnik, gave the world the illusion that central planning worked. The state could allocate resources perfectly, eliminate the chaos of the market, and guarantee full employment. But this success was built on two unsustainable pillars. The first was brutal resource extraction, forcing citizens into labor, confiscating agricultural output, and prioritizing heavy industry, steel, military over consumer needs. The second was the hidden deficit. By the 1960s, the USSR was facing two huge financial problems. Externally, it needed hard currency, US dollars, German marks, to buy advanced technology, and, crucially, to purchase massive amounts of grain from the West to feed its population, as its collectivized farms consistently failed. Internally, the government was printing rubles to pay for its massive military budget and to subsidize basic goods, bread, rent, fuel, to keep the population passive. This is the Soviet subsidy trap. Imagine a loaf of bread in Moscow. The cost to the state to produce that bread, from growing the grain to baking it and transporting it, might be 5 rubles. But the government sells it to the citizen for 1 ruble. That 4-ruble gap is a hidden debt. It's a liability the state absorbs. Multiply that across every product, every service, every housing unit, and every military base in 15 republics, and you have a fiscal black hole the size of a continent. By the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, this systemic deficit was not just a hole. It was the foundation upon which the entire consumer economy rested. The state was simultaneously telling its citizens the economy was strong, while, behind the scenes, it was drowning in its own red ink. This is the first lesson the Anglosphere needs to learn from the Soviet collapse. Subsidized stability is not stability, it is deferred debt. It's a financial ticking time bomb where the eventual explosion is not caused by war, but by the simple, inescapable math of insolvency. The central planners tried to solve this with more central planning. They issued more of those compulsory state bonds, essentially pulling money out of the system that was already worthless, creating an ever larger pool of future obligations they knew they could never repay. This was the bond market nightmare's quiet beginning, a nightmare that no one saw coming, because the entire system was designed to hide the truth from everyone, especially the financial masters in the Kremlin. The facade was solid, but the foundation was made of IOUs, written on thin air. The world was about to see how quickly that facade could crumble when a real market shock hit. The seeds of destruction for the Soviet financial system were internal, planted by decades of central planning and subsidized debt. But the trigger, the explosive force that detonated the hidden debt machine, was purely external, a surgical financial strike executed by the West. This is the critical, often ignored chapter of the Cold War. While President Reagan was increasing military spending and calling the USSR the evil empire, a more subtle and deadly financial strategy was being deployed, one that targeted the Soviet Union's only reliable source of hard currency, oil exports. This was the Cold War's true financial battle. The Soviet Union had, by the 1970s, become heavily reliant on selling Siberian oil and natural gas to Western Europe for US dollars. These dollars were essential, not for internal rubles, but for buying grain and high-tech equipment the inefficient Soviet system could not produce itself. When oil prices were high, like during the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks, the Soviet government, under the leadership of Brezhnev, experienced a deceptive period of prosperity. They mistook a temporary spike in commodity prices for the triumph of their economic model. This financial hubris led them to double down on their unsustainable military build-up and their massive subsidy structure, digging the debt hole deeper. They believed their oil revenue was immortal. The West, led by the US and the UK, saw this vulnerability not as a side effect, but as a strategic target. The plan, often attributed to a coordination between the Reagan administration and Saudi Arabia in the early 1980s, was simple yet devastating: crush the oil price. Beginning in 1985, Saudi Arabia dramatically increased its oil production. Suddenly, the global market was flooded. The price of a barrel of crude oil, which had been around $30 in 1981, plummeted to under $10 a barrel by 1986. For the West, this was a boon. For the Soviet Union, it was a cataclysm. Overnight, their source of hard currency dried up. Imagine a corporation that relies entirely on one product, and the price of that product drops by 2/3 in a year. That's what happened to the USSR's budget. This was the moment the ghost debt became real. The Soviet government still had to pay for the grain imports, still had to finance the massive military machine, and still had to maintain the internal subsidies to prevent civil unrest. With the oil revenue gone, they had only two choices: drastically cut spending and subsidies, which would ignite riots, or borrow money internationally. They chose to borrow. The late 1980s saw the Soviet Union scrambling for loans from Western banks and even the Japanese. This external debt while small compared to modern sovereign debt, was catastrophic because it exposed the internal fiction. The state was forced to promise real assets or hard currency, which it didn't have, to foreigners because its own internal ruble was non-convertible and meaningless outside its borders. The structural flaws in the Soviet bond market now became a true nightmare. Internally, citizens holding those compulsory state bonds began to realize that the promissory notes were completely worthless. There was nothing to buy with the interest they were paid anyway, because the supply of consumer goods was collapsing. The ruble itself was experiencing repressed inflation. Officially, the price of bread was stable, but the amount of money chasing those goods was exploding, creating massive shortages, long lines, and a thriving black market where a US dollar was worth 20 times the official rate. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were an attempt to plug this financial hole, but they were too little, too late, and fundamentally misunderstood the depth of the crisis. Perestroika tried to introduce market mechanisms and allow some state enterprises to become self-financing. Instead of fixing the system, it simply exposed its rotten core. Factories that had been propped up by state subsidies for decades suddenly faced market reality and immediately failed, leading to unemployment and social unrest. This created a vicious cycle. The financial crisis caused social unrest, forcing the government to increase spending, more debt, to quell the unrest, which only deepened the financial crisis. The bond market nightmare wasn't just in the balance sheet. It was in the hands of every Soviet citizen who held a worthless ruble and a pointless state bond, watching their supermarkets empty out. The Western financial strike had succeeded. The internal, unpayable debt was finally being exposed to the light of day, forcing the system to collapse under its own weight. The world was about to witness the spectacular final implosion of a financial system built entirely on the illusion of state infallibility. The year 1991 was not the year the Soviet Union collapsed. It was the year its financial fiction was finally violently exposed. By the time the August coup failed, the Soviet financial system was already in terminal decline. The oil price shock had starved the central government of the hard currency it needed, and perestroika had simply transformed the repressed inflation into hyperinflation. The ghost debt, the trillions of subsidized rubles and compulsory bonds, had reached its reckoning. The core of the final collapse lies in the crisis of confidence in Gosbank, the Soviet state bank. Central banks, whether in Moscow or Manhattan, operate on one principle: confidence. When a central bank loses the belief of its population, the currency becomes useless, and the state's ability to govern evaporates. In the USSR, this loss of confidence was total. The ruble, once a proud symbol of the nation, became the universal joke, famously worth more as toilet paper, which was also scarce, than as a means of exchange. The final nightmare scenario unfolded not on the battlefields, but in the supply chains. Republics and regions, seeing the central government's financial impotence, simply stopped sending goods to Moscow. They began to issue their own surrogate currencies, or simply resorted to pure barter. A factory in Ukraine would trade steel for oil from Russia, bypassing the worthless ruble entirely. This process, known as the War of Laws, or Parade of Sovereignties, was fundamentally a financial secession. The republics were not just declaring political independence, they were declaring financial independence from Gosbank and the bankrupt central government. The ruble's non-convertibility, which the state had used for decades as a tool of control, now became its undoing. Since the ruble couldn't be spent or exchanged outside the Soviet bloc, the republics had no incentive to send their valuable goods, oil, wheat, gold, to Moscow in exchange for a worthless IOU. This financial paralysis meant the Soviet economy fractured into 15 separate non-functioning bartering systems. The ultimate failure was the repudiation of the bond market nightmare. The state bonds, which had forced millions of Soviet citizens to surrender a portion of their wages for decades, became officially and openly null and void. The savings of an entire generation, the sacrifices made in the name of the socialist project, were wiped out overnight. This wasn't just an economic event, it was a profound psychological betrayal that cemented the population's willingness to see the entire system dissolve. When a government defaults on its internal obligations, whether they are bonds, savings, or pension promises, it loses its moral and financial legitimacy. The Soviet government lost this battle not because it was poor, but because it had chosen to finance its existence through a debt structure that was inherently fraudulent, designed to hide costs rather than create real wealth. The cost of their military expansion, their space race, and their massive social subsidies had simply been kicked into the future, disguised as compulsory savings and stability. The lesson of the Soviet financial collapse is the most profound and relevant warning for the Western world today, particularly for the English-speaking countries currently drowning in their own sovereign debt. The USSR taught us that a government can control everything and still be financially broke. They lacked an external bond market check, so they created a massive internal debt machine that destroyed them. Modern Western governments, particularly the US, UK, and Eurozone, face a similar, if more sophisticated, trap. They utilize central bank policy, quantitative easing and monetizing the debt, which is structurally similar to the Soviet method of funding deficits by printing currency and forcing citizens to hold ever-devaluing paper. We see the same parallels: massive military spending, unsustainable entitlement programs, and a steady erosion of currency value, inflation, that acts as a hidden tax on the population, a modern equivalent of the Soviet subsidy trap. The current mountain of global debt, whether it's called a US Treasury bond or a Soviet Gosbank obligation, is still a promise. The only difference is that the promise in the West is currently backed by slightly more confidence and a slightly more efficient, productive economy. But if the Soviet Union, with all its military might and state control, could not outrun the inevitable math of insolvency, no modern nation is safe. The bond market nightmare that brought down the Soviet Union is a ghost that still haunts the financial system of every country that believes it can borrow its way to eternal prosperity. The question is not if the reckoning will come, but whether you, unlike the citizens of the USSR, will be prepared when the facade finally falls.